Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Class E Podcast. I am your host, Mary Sturgill. This is the podcast that's brought to you through a partnership between the Hill Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship here at Furman University and the Comm Studies Department. Today, we have a very special guest because we are taping this podcast in front of a live studio audience on Furman University campus. Jason Feifer joins us. Everybody give Jason a round of applause. We're so glad you're here.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's just start with kind of your background. I know our students are very interested how people get to where they are today. Yep. You're currently the editor-in-chief of Entrepreneur magazine. You host a podcast. You've written a book. You're doing a book tour. Very busy guy, right? So talk about how you got to this spot a little bit.
Sure. So I graduated Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts in 2002. And what I wanted to do was be a newspaper reporter. So I got a job at the Gardner News, 6,000 circulation, North Central Massachusetts, paying me $20,000 a year and covering nothing. Like nothing was happening. And if anybody ever invites you to a zoning board of appeals meeting, like say no, it is the most boring thing. And after a year of that, I'll tell you, I became bitter. And the reason was because I had these big ambitions, and I couldn't have articulated at the time exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew that it was not be at this little tiny paper. I imagined writing for the New York Times or the Washington Post or something, doing big things, and I was starting to really resent that little newspaper and everyone there for keeping me there, which is not really a fair way to think of it. And that's what I discovered when one day my boss, Stu Norwood, came up to me and handed me a letter. And that letter basically said, change your attitude or get the hell out of here. And I realized in that moment a couple of things that were important. Number one, that I needed to humble myself because I kept thinking I'm better than this place. But really, if I was better than that place, then I wouldn't have been at that place. And that number two, that I think the reason why I was growing so bitter was because I kept just waiting for somebody to celebrate me. And I realized
that doesn't happen in the news business.
That doesn't happen in any business. It doesn't happen anywhere, right? There was no chance that anybody at the New York Times was ever calling me up and saying, kid, we loved that story about the middle school dance. You're covering the White House. Right? This was not happening. So I realized I needed to go to them. And that was the big first lesson of my career, and one that still guides me today. Go to them. Never, never wait for someone to come to you. I quit that job. I sat in my bedroom in a rural town in Massachusetts, literally in a dumpy apartment next to a graveyard. It cost me $500 a month to be here. And I'd be there, and I started cold pitching. Started just pitching editors ideas who I didn't know, and mostly they ignored me. Occasionally they rejected me. Very occasionally they said yes. But that's how I got my first story in the Washington Post, in the Associated Press, in Boston Globe. And it taught me a lesson that I carry forward in everything that I do, which is no matter what I'm doing, make sure that I am finding a way to get in front of people, to go to them, and never wait for someone to recognize me.
Every job that I have ever gotten, especially when I was in TV news, it's because I sought them out and I said, hey, can I come visit you? Right? And I got to them face to face. Because looking at somebody on a tape and interacting with them face to face, totally different, right? Face to face is huge. So let's move to the podcast, because it's face to face for us, but not necessarily for listeners. Sure. Tell us about your podcast. It has a historical slant.
Yes, it does. So the show is called Build for Tomorrow, just like the book. And it's funny, I've gone through actually a number of iterations of exactly what this show is. I think that we should always be thinking everything that we make, you have to go out and understand who your audience is and how you serve them. And the show, what I call it now is a show about the smartest solutions to our most misunderstood problems. The way I got there, really interestingly, was that I started this show, and it had a different name. It was called Pessimist's Archive, and it was an archive of pessimists. That was the idea. Look back into the past at people who said something wasn't going to work out and try to understand what they were thinking. Mm-hmm. And then I hired, a couple years in, a consultancy, and they surveyed my audience and came back to me with some unbelievably valuable insights. Number one, they told me that the name is a massive turnoff. That even though I thought it was clever, people were experiencing it as, this is a show that's pessimistic, or this is a show for pessimists.
Yeah, you're just going to sit up there and complain.
And that, right, I'm going to be Andy Rooney. And that was not the case. And so I was creating a barrier to entry, and I needed to change that. And then I also learned that people were listening to the show because it helped them feel more resilient about the future. And once I knew that information, I said, okay, I need to rebrand this, and I need to lean into where people see the value. That's something that, look, regardless of what you do, and especially if we have entrepreneurship students here, you must always make sure that you understand your audience at a granular level, and it will almost always be certain that you do not know your audience as well as you think you do, which means that you have to be constantly pushing yourself to understand the thing that you're missing, because that's going to give you the direction for how to actually serve people.
100%, and that goes for our storytelling students as well. You have to know your audience.
Right.
So what kinds of things do you talk about now? Because that's a pivot, right?
Yeah.
You did a pulse check, right? And you pivoted.
Well, so I still bring a lot of history in because what I really love about history is that the decisions that people made in the past, we can see how they played out. We know how the story ended in some way when you look at history, which is different from now. We don't know how the stories of our lives or our businesses or our whatevers are going to end. And so we can only guess as to the wisdom of our decisions. But when you look back in time, you can see how people's decisions led to action or inaction or results. And so I love taking questions that are contemporary and trying to understand the history to them. Today, people complain, nobody wants to work anymore. Perhaps you've heard that phrase. Nobody wants to work anymore. Like, what's up with people quitting their jobs, the great resignation, because nobody wants to work anymore. Actually, people have been complaining about that for an incredibly long time. Like, at least 150 years worth of nobody wants to work anymore in newspapers. And there was a professor at Calgary University of Calgary who had found all these amazing clippings, and there was a viral tweet in which he put out all these clippings from the newspapers saying nobody wants to work anymore for 100 years. And I wanted to know what was going on for 100 years that people were making that complaint, and then how could we understand our own time by understanding what happened back then, so that we can start thinking smarter about what people really do want today. And so I called this work historian named Peter Stearns, and I just read him all of these newspaper clippings and then asked him to tell me what was going on at the time. And he told me these fascinating changes, but what was really happening is that over time, across time, there are these moments in which the nature of work changes. And when that happens, workers see an opportunity to negotiate a better deal for themselves. Doesn't mean they don't want to work hard. They do want to work hard. But they also want fair compensation, and they want work that's going to be satisfying to them. And they see that as an opportunity. That's what we have now. We have to recognize that and not just say people don't want to work.
Right, exactly. Because after COVID, people realized we can work differently than we were before.
And I'm so glad that we have. It's an amazing conversation we're having.
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about other innovations and changes that have happened that you've kind of have your pulse on, have the pulse of. What other ones stick out in your mind other than nobody wants to work?
A couple things that are really interesting to me right now. Number one is the questions about the future of work and the way that we're working. I think we're having a fascinating and incredibly important conversation right now about that. And I think that what work looks like in 5 or 10 years is not going to be what it looks like right now, and it's not going to be what it looked like in 2019, and that's going to be for the better for everybody. I'm really excited about that. I also hear a lot of people talk about, it's really fascinating, so, if you go around asking people, where is innovation going to happen right now? The answer that I keep hearing is innovation is going to happen in boring spaces, right? That we have moved through this cycle of Silicon Valley pumping out very buzzy startups and focused on oftentimes a convenience economy, and that right now, a lot of really smart entrepreneurs are recognizing that great opportunity is actually in these spaces that have been overlooked for innovation, and therefore where there's just a ton of white space. So what does that mean? Insurance, healthcare, transportation, right? These things that they just like half the audience fell asleep with the words that I just said there, right? But that's actually where people are desperate for innovation, and those are the things that are underneath our lives.
I would think too, especially with our infrastructure in the situation that it's in right now, all across the country, right? I mean, we really need an infrastructure upgrade all over the place. That's where part of that's going to come from.
That's right. I do some startup advising. And I'm an advisor to a company. I'll tell you about it. So a couple years ago, I get a call from this guy, and he gets me on the phone because he wants some advice about PR for this company of his that was in stealth at the time, but it's not now. It's called Hybritech. And it is a solution to wildfires because, of course, right, we have these terrible problems with wildfires, particularly in California, Colorado. These wildfires are sweeping through, they're destroying homes, it's awful. And the solution, to the degree that there is a solution right now, is some kind of fireproofing of homes. But it doesn't really work because in the middle of a wildfire, no amount of fireproofing can protect a home. So he had come up with an idea that, frankly, my 7-year-old would come up with because it's so ridiculous, right? And the idea is that when the wildfire is coming, you press a button and your home lowers into the ground. And it just hibernates underground until the fire has passed or anything else has passed. And I saw this and I laughed because it's so crazy. But the guy had spent years developing the technology, and he now has patents on it, and it is a very serious company, and he's a very serious person. I said, you don't need a PR right now, but I am fascinated by this, and I would love to be helpful in this journey. So I'm now an equity advisor, and the reason I tell you that story is because, look, that is kind of flashy in a weird way, but it's solving a very unflashy problem, right? Which is just, it's a construction problem, it's an environment problem, it's a real estate problem. And none of those are cool apps that you go and you just raise $1 bazillion for. And those are the things that I'm really excited about because I think those are the ideas that are ultimately going to transform our lives.
Yeah. I have a question about this because I'm just envisioning this in my mind.
Yes.
This house going down into the ground. Would they be able to retrofit houses for that, or would it all be new construction?
It's all new construction. The idea is that this is what somebody would buy after their house burns down. So the way that he's designed it is that, so you press the button and all of your utilities disconnect, right? Because you can't drag all your utilities down. So all your utilities disconnect. As it lowers into the ground, flame retardant gets sprayed on the in case there have been any embers, because you don't want it to just go down and then burn. And then it gets covered. And now to be clear, this doesn't exist in the world. He hasn't built a prototype yet, but he has spent an insane amount of money developing the technology and has it patented. And now he's in the process of going out and raising money to build that prototype. And so I've been advising him. You know, he'll text me in a panic, late at night because he just had a conversation with an investor and doesn't know what to do next. And I get such a thrill out of being along for wild moonshot journeys like this because, look, it's a crazy idea, but one of the things that I want to go back to this because I said this thing that was just like it's an idea that my 7-year-old would have, I don't mean that as an insult, I mean it as a compliment. Because what you will often hear, and I've heard this from just some of the world's most successful people, Naveen Jain, for example, who is a healthcare company and a space company, and he talks a lot about how his advantage is that he goes into industries that he doesn't really know anything about. And as a result, he's able to look with fresh eyes.
Yeah.
Just the way that students entering a new space, you look with fresh eyes, which means that you're not going to discount ideas just because 10 years ago somebody said, oh, that's not going to work.
Right. Or they tell you right then it's not going to work.
Right. Because you instead are able to see clearly things that people in an industry for a long time cannot, because they have filtered out all fresh ideas. And that is why I love what Holden is doing with Hybritech, is because he doesn't come from the real estate construction. So he has a crazy idea that nobody inside the industry would think of, and then he took it seriously. Whereas everyone else might say, that sounds ridiculous, it's a funny idea, but we're not even going to bother exploring that. I love that stuff. And I think that that's the future.
I think that's a great nugget for all of you to take with you, is that stick onto those ideas and come at every idea with, don't poo-poo it, right? Come with every idea with a childlike mind. Don't put up roadblocks where they don't exist.
That's right.
Right.
To this, it's one of the first big lessons I learned at work. I was a junior reporter at a newspaper, and here's what I would do. I would go out and I would interview these people who, they're local, but they're very experienced in whatever they're doing. I'm sitting down with a local mayor or a local fire chief or a local hospital CEO, and they would say something to me and I wouldn't know what it means. So I remember, for example, that the mayor would say that the city just put out an RFP for something. And I would write RFP, and then I would circle it, and I would put a question mark in my notebook. And that was a signal for me later to go back to my office and try to figure out what RFP means. Now, what it means is request for proposal. The reason I did that was because I didn't want to tell the mayor I don't know what that means. Because I thought that if the mayor knew that I didn't know what an RFP means, then the mayor would think, well, how can I trust this guy, anything that I'm telling him? And then I would look foolish and not trustworthy, and I wouldn't be able to do my job.
You know, in broadcast, that was easier for me, because you know how I phrased that question?
Huh.
I would say, for people who don't know, please explain.
Yeah, that's useful. Right. Which I couldn't quite do, and it's print.
Right, because it's on camera.
Right, for the ghosts.
Print is a little bit harder.
So, but then an older reporter in my office, I mentioned this to him once, and he said, no, that's the totally wrong way to go about it. Never be afraid to ask the dumb questions, he said. Never. And the reason is because when you ask simple questions like that, what you're actually doing is signaling to someone that you are very interested and thorough. And I learned this and that's what I started to do. And then I added onto this sort of similar body of knowledge and awareness much later. About a year or so ago, I was at 30 Rock in Jimmy Fallon's office. And I was interviewing Jimmy for the cover of the magazine, and at the end of, I might have been there for 2 hours, Jimmy says, if you need anything else, if you're writing the story and you think, I wish I could have asked him that, just reach out. And I said, Jimmy, I appreciate that. I'm not going to do that because you've given me so much of your time, but thank you. And then I go home, and I work on this story, and a week later, at the sort of towards the end of the story, and I realize I can't get to the end of the story without a piece of information that I did not think to ask him. Like, there was an insight, it was set up, and I didn't think in the moment, and I cannot believe I missed it. I need to get back in touch with Jimmy, and I feel foolish because I promised him that I wouldn't, and I try never to do this. People are busy, they give me their time, but I reached out to his publicist, and I said, can I get Jimmy back on the phone for 10 minutes? And it took like a week, but my phone rings, and it's Jimmy Fallon, and the first thing he says to me is, it's so funny, I always offer people that they can follow up if they need something, and nobody ever takes me up on it, and you did. And I said, Jimmy, I honestly didn't want to because you gave me the time that we agreed upon, even more, and I don't want to bother you, so I'm sorry that I got you on the phone. And he says, are you kidding me? Like, you following up means that you want to get this really right. And it shows me how thorough you are. And that makes me more excited to talk with you. And that is a lesson that I will always carry forward, that sometimes the thing that you think is a disadvantage is actually an advantage.
100%. I always leave an interview with, if I have questions, if I need more explanation, may I call you? Yeah, so I've opened that door. Sometimes the entrepreneur space and the innovation space is difficult for minorities and for women. What kind, is that getting any better in what you're seeing?
Yes and no. The no is in traditional investment. The numbers are atrocious.
Yeah.
Just absolutely atrocious. And I haven't seen the numbers within the last year or so specific to minority investment, but I have for women, and it went down the last couple of years. That's awful. The investment community should be ashamed.
Because it was already bad.
Because it was already terrible, right. But what has happened in the last number of years is just a tremendous rise in self-supporting communities. And I see it. I see it, for example, that I will meet, let's say, a investor. I mean, just use it, but it doesn't have to be. It could be let's set investors aside. A CEO who, a female CEO, a black CEO, whoever. And what I find is that they are not just great representatives for their brand, but they also want to introduce me to a million other people who they have built a network with, who they support, who they get support from, and they are looking out for every opportunity for their whole community. It is awesome to see, and as a result, you're seeing amazing businesses come out of those communities, but they are operating at a disadvantage with financing, and for that matter, they're also often operating at a disadvantage with even getting bank financing. Right. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but I think about this every year with the October issue of Entrepreneur Magazine. We call it the 100 Women of Influence, is what it is now. And every year that we make it, I end up in this conversation with somebody, usually somebody internally, where we say, I really kind of can't wait for the time in which it doesn't make sense to run a women's issue, because the way that newspapers used to run women's pages, right? And now that seems totally obnoxious because every page is for men and women, and it should be that way with with coverage of businesses, and I know that there are a lot of female CEOs out there who are actually very sick of being in the women's issue stuff. But the reason we still do it is because there is still there is a community of women who think of themselves as champions of women. You got all these companies like Chief that are really focused in on that specific community, and we're just frankly still in a time in which speaking to a specific community of entrepreneurs is seen as a positive and a sign of support. But I think what we really need to get to is a place where there's just so much equity of access that we're not talking that way.
Right. And what will it take to change all that, so you don't have to do that issue?
I think that what it takes is going to start with what you're seeing, which is that you need more people, you need more women, you need more, more not white people. You need less of me in leadership roles. And the reason for that is because once you have that, they are going to open doors that would have been shut, maybe not by bias, but just by ignorance. Mm-hmm. That, people operate off of their networks. They just do.
Yeah, and, that's true.
Look, I'm as guilty about it as anybody, because when as the editor-in-chief of a magazine, if I have an opening for a role and I have a small team, the first thing that I think about is, who have I worked with in the past that I trust? Because I want to find someone good, and I want to know they're good, and I don't want to take the chance. So who have I worked with? And look, that doesn't just mean white men, right? I've worked with a broad range of people, and the staff is represented, but the bias is that it's coming out of my network, and my network is going to be driven by wherever I worked. And I want to fix that in our own hiring, but the reality is that people will bring their networks. And so the more leaders you can get, the more they will bring their networks and open up doors for the network effect.
Yeah, and people who are coming behind them.
Yeah.
Yeah. In your book, you talk about change.
Yeah.
And that's what we were just discussing as well. But you say that there are 4 parts to change. Give them a brief synopsis of what you talk about in the book.
Before the pandemic, I had found that the most successful people are adaptable. It is the thing that drives success. And I wanted to understand what it was. What were people doing? What could you learn to become more adaptable? And then the pandemic came along, and it was, among many things, a very interesting experiment. Because what you got was everybody going through the exact same change at the same time, and then diverging greatly. And some people reinventing their careers and their businesses, and some people being very unable to do that. And I wanted to understand what was happening with the people who were moving fast. And what I came to realize in just talking to tons and tons of people was that change for everybody happens in 4 phases. Panic, adaptation, new normal, wouldn't go back. Wouldn't go back being that moment where you say, I have something so new and valuable that I wouldn't want to go back to a time before I had it. And that is something that's available to everybody. But some people are just exceptionally good at moving through those earlier stages. And I wanted to know what was it that was enabling people to move faster through early stages so that they could reach a wouldn't go back moment. So that's what the book is. It's really me gathering the insights and lessons from the most accomplished people that I've met and through the history of innovation as well to try to help people move through those stages.
Yeah, I love that. The Classy podcast is all about entrepreneurs. And on that podcast, of course, we talk about people's why. Yeah. And in your book, you talk about people's why, but you also talk about the what. Mm-hmm. And I know as a journalist, when I was a journalist, my why was to tell the community story, right? My what was, that's where I found my identity. And so who am I without the title journalist in front of my name, right? And I think a lot of us as professionals go through that because we are so tied to what we do. Explain how you divide those two.
I think that we make a mistake. And
it is a big mistake.
It's a big, it's a big mistake. And we'll all make it. I've made it. And that mistake is that we identify with the product of our work. We tie our identities to our job or to the product that we make or the role that we occupy or something, which is fine in a way, but the problem is that when you do that, you are setting yourself up for a massive disruption because all of those things that you tie yourself to are things that are changeable, very easily changed. And so if you are attaching your identity to something that's easily changed, you will not just experience a change in work, you'll experience a change in self. And that's what feels incredibly scary. So what I found, though, is that entrepreneurs think quite differently. Entrepreneurs have this way of thinking about who they are or what their company is in a way that is not attached to things that are easily changeable. Examples. I remember talking to the CEO of a baked goods company called Food Stirs. You can find their baking mixes in Whole Foods or whatever. And they were going through a big change at the time, big product change. And I asked him if it was challenging, and he said, because there were some setbacks, and he said, no, because you go back to what's the point of it all. And the point of it is to bring joy to people with upgraded sweet baked goods, right? Which I love. To bring joy to people with upgraded sweet baked goods, because that isn't tied to any one product. So maybe they make baking mixes, and then one day everybody in the world hates baking mixes. That doesn't take away their ability to bring joy to people with upgraded sweet baked goods. Similarly, I used to think of myself as a newspaper reporter. I stayed in 2 newspaper jobs longer than I should have. Part of the reason I realize now was because I thought of myself as a newspaper reporter. And it was very hard to separate that, to even envision walking away from something that was core to my identity, even if I didn't like the work. I'd made the same mistake for a long time later in my career with magazines. I thought of myself solely as a magazine editor. I stayed in jobs I should not have. Now I don't. Here's what I tell myself. And here's what I would suggest everybody do, is you find a sentence. You come up with a single sentence where every word is selected because it is not anchored to something that easily changes. For me, for example, my sentence for myself is, I tell stories in my own voice. I tell stories. Because consider it. Check this out. This is my phone. And at any time, my boss, the president of Entrepreneur, could call me on this phone. He could call me right now. It would be very weird. And he could fire me. He could. Nothing's stopping him. He could fire me. And if my identity is I'm a magazine editor, then I am one phone call away from losing my identity.
Right.
That is a dangerous position. That is not something I want to do. And so I want to think of myself not as a magazine editor, but as a storyteller. Because that means that if he calls me and fires me, he has not taken away my ability to tell stories. Then, in my own voice, that's me setting the terms for how I operate. So that was not what I would have said earlier in my career.
Right.
Earlier in my career, I would have gone,
I'm a journalist.
I'm a journalist, or I just show up, tell me what to do, I'll do it, I'm here to learn. Now, I mean, I'm always here to learn, but I'm also here to do. And I'm going to do it based on what I have to say, because I've reached a stage in my career where I feel confident that I have something to offer that's mine. I want to put things on my shoulders. I tell stories in my own voice. I suggest everybody think about what that sentence would be for yourself, and then be open to revising it as you go.
I think all of my students need to write that sentence down, because we're doing digital storytelling right now and advanced storytelling, some of our students, and I think we have some writing students in here as well. So that's a good mantra for everyone to take with them. I think we should probably open it up to student questions. So are there any questions from the audience?
Hi, so I want to ask you, through your up and downs in your journey, what keeps you moving?
Thanks. That's a great question. I appreciate it. And thank you for being bold enough to go first. So the question is, through my ups and downs of my journey, what keeps me going? I have never been, I'm going to say this in a way that's going to sound wrong, and then I'm going to define it. I've never been goal-oriented, by which I mean that I've never anchored myself to one specific goal, because I think that that's ultimately too limiting. I interviewed Malcolm Gladwell a number of years ago, and he said this thing that I really loved. We were talking about how he figures out what a Malcolm Gladwell project is. Malcolm Gladwell, best-selling author, podcaster. And he said to me this line that I immediately wrote down and slapped on my wall. It was, self-conceptions are powerfully limiting. Which is to say that if you have too narrow a definition of yourself, then you will turn down all the other opportunities available to you. And what I have discovered throughout my career is that the greatest opportunities were the ones that I could not have seen coming. Entrepreneur Magazine, being the editor-in-chief, has provided me access to the world and new opportunities that I could not have ever foreseen. Guess what? I never heard of Entrepreneur Magazine until, I don't even know, 8 or 9 years ago. I mean, certainly for the majority of my career, I'd never heard of it. And so if I had too specific of a goal and then only focused on it, I think that I would feel like progress is slow and maybe progress is impossible. But instead, what I like to do is just focus on the project. And to me, the project, and this is like the phrasing that I use for it, this is the project right here, it's me. Like, this is the project. And I know that the more that I put into the project, the bigger the outcomes are. And so I push myself to do things that are outside of what I'm being asked to do, because what I continue to discover is that it always leads to new opportunities. Right? Nobody asked me to come down here. I'm here before you. Nobody asked me. Entrepreneur does not ask me to go traveling around talking. They also didn't ask me to write that book. I did it myself. I reached out to Furman. Nobody asked me to do this. But I know that if I push myself to start explore speaking, figure out how to be good at it, write a book, reach out to places, that suddenly I'm going places and I'm meeting new people and I'm having new opportunities, and all of that builds the project.
Yeah, I like that. Storytellers, he's the project. You're the project. Next question from the audience. Go ahead and come up to the mic.
I wanted to talk about your Hypertech example that you're talking about. And I think it's quite interesting comparing it to the concept of division of labour by Adam Smith. You spoke particularly about how if you have people who aren't experts in an area come into a particular field, they can create new ideas and bring innovation to the field. Do you think the division of labour and the idea of specialising in a particular area creates a bit of a contrast there and a bit of a conflict, perhaps?
That's a good question.
That's a great question. Wow. I don't get a lot of Adam Smith dropped on me, so I appreciate that. Look, there are no universals. And so, for every Holden, who is the founder of Hypertech, who, let's be clear, and Holden would agree with this, Holden could transform real estate, or he could have wasted a lot of money. It's going to be one of the two. Right. And Holden knows it, right? And so, but even if Holden doesn't succeed, there are plenty of people like him who went into a space that they didn't know anything about and came up with a crazy idea, right? Like there are plenty of other Brian Chesky's who made Airbnb, right? Which is not something, nobody from the hotel industry would have come up with Airbnb. It took somebody from outside of that space to come up with that. So that's great, but that's not the only way to innovate at all. There are also plenty of great, brilliant companies that came out of people who spent a long time in that space and saw opportunity that other people didn't. Eric, the founder of Zoom, for example, he was an employee at GoToMeeting, and then he realized, maybe he was the only person at GoToMeeting who realized this, but certainly anyone who's ever used GoToMeeting would know that thing sucks, right? And there's like definitely a better product that could be made. And so he spent a lot of time in that space. Right? He's an engineer and he understood it, and now he got to know that particular arena. He became a specialist in it, and he said, I can do this much better, and he did. And so I think that look, it could go either way. I think the question really is how can you, either leveraging what you do or do not know, identify opportunity? And look, there's a third way. And the third way is that you get into something, it doesn't matter what it is, and it doesn't work. And the failure informs the thing that will work. So a classic example of that is Stuart Butterfield, who started a video game company, and the video game company didn't work. But as he was shutting the thing down, he said, you know, we built this internal chat system in the video game, and people really liked that. I wonder if I could just spin that out as its own product, and that became Slack. So like, there are a lot of ways to approach it, but I think you sort of basically start with identifying a solution to people's problems, and then figuring out how to make it happen. I guess Adam Smith is as right as he is wrong, but it's a I think you never really want to limit how you see opportunity if you see opportunity.
Yeah, good question. All right, I think we have time for one more question.
My question is, if you could do one thing differently in your career path, what would you have done differently? My
first book was a romantic comedy novel that I wrote with my wife that came out in 2018. And we started working on it before I became editor-in-chief of Entrepreneur magazine. And before this, I was just like a random magazine editor, right? Like I moved around. I was at Men's Health. I was at Fast Company. I was at Max. I was just a guy who shows up and makes media. So I didn't have a particular niche. People didn't know me as any one thing. That's when I started this project. But it takes many years to write and sell a novel. And by the time that it came out, I was editor-in-chief of Entrepreneur magazine. And people expected a certain thing from me. And so now here comes this romantic comedy coming out on a major press. And I was getting two very different responses depending upon who I was talking to. If I was talking to friends in media, they would say, congratulations, it's so exciting that you wrote the book and it got sold. And entrepreneurs would say, oh, that's interesting, what are you going to do with it? And the reason that I realized were saying that was because entrepreneurs think differently than everyone else does. Because most people, including myself up until then, thought horizontally. Do something, put it out in the world, move along. Do something, put it out in the world, move along. Do something, and you'd move horizontally. Entrepreneurs don't think that way. Entrepreneurs think vertically. They think that the only reason to do something is because it is the foundation upon which the next thing will be built. And so you go and you start, why release a romantic comedy? Probably, I guess, because he's going to start a school where he's going to teach people how to write novels. I don't know. There must be some explanation for this, right? And so, but that's how they think. And to your question, the reason I'm telling you this story is because I have absorbed that thinking. It took a long time, but I absorbed it. And it totally transformed the way that I think about the project, because I now do things because they lead to other things. And I am constantly thinking about how can I move through the world trying to accrue as many resources and value as possible. Even a small thing.
Like the book.
Well, like the book.
Yeah.
You know what the purpose of this is? The purpose of this is to, thank you for continuing to model it. The purpose of that is to create a foundation for myself, a sort of thought leadership foundation that I own, right? Because Entrepreneur Magazine is an amazing platform, but I don't own that company, so I want things that I own. And then also, books boost speaking fees. Yes. And that can be very lucrative. It already is, and I would like it to be even more lucrative. And it just has all these other follow-on effects. Right? This is the reason why a whole bunch of giant podcasters had me on their podcasts in the last couple of months. So there's a reason to do that. But also, I have a spreadsheet, a Google Docs, or Google Sheets, I guess it is. And it's called Good Contacts. And everybody who I meet who I think could be valuable to me in some way in the future, they go in there, they go in Good Contacts. I have it divided up into all these little tabs. I wish, to your question, I wish that I was thinking more about how to build upon the things that I was doing earlier in my career, because I think that I would have built something bigger by now. I mean, what I have, I'm very happy with, but I could be ahead. But I didn't think to do this or think like this until later in my career.
You didn't necessarily have that innovative mindset.
I didn't.
Right, yet.
I thought of myself as a writer and as someone who kind of creates things and puts them out into the world, and then we'll see what happens, and then I'll move on to the next.
I believe writers are entrepreneurs.
Yes.
They most definitely are.
But they have to think of themselves as entrepreneurs.
Exactly, and that's where I think so many of them fail. But I would argue too, or I believe, let me put it this way, I believe that first book led you, and your career led you to this book.
In one way or another, yes. But it could have been more intentional.
Right.
And it could have been faster. Right? I mean, this is the thing. Like, I really think that if you take the project seriously, you'll find a great path for it. But if you surround yourself with people who think incredibly structurally, then the project will be built faster.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I think we probably need to wrap it up unless there's one more question.
What did that call look like that you made to this school to come here?
When I had about a year to go before the book launch, I am thinking, how can I control sales, right? There are a lot of things that I can do that will hopefully lead to sales, right? I can call in every favor that I've got to Gary Vaynerchuk and Lewis Howes and whoever, and they'll have me on their podcast, and Barbara Corcoran, and hopefully their listeners will hear it and they'll buy the book. But I don't have full control over that. I don't know how many books that's going to sell. I can buy ads. I've done that too. But again, who knows? So I'm thinking to myself, what can I do to guarantee sales? I just want numbers on the board right now. And one of the things I think about is, there are a lot of entrepreneurship programs at universities, and I bet that they would like me to show up and speak to their students. And as a result, I mean, just this week alone, Monday I was at Rowan University in New Jersey. Tuesday I was at Penn State. Wednesday I was at home. Today I flew down here and I go back tomorrow. And I've had a lot of that, right? And every one of those, I showed up because they bought books in advance. There they are. And
it's a great strategy.
And it's funny because then for me, the stakes are very low, right? Like, I am so thrilled that you all came out tonight, but frankly, if one person showed up, the same number of books were bought.
Smart.
To me, that is about thinking constantly about how do I accrue resources and then utilize those resources in smart ways, and make sure always, whenever you reach out to anybody about anything, which is what I've done, like here, make sure that it feels like value to both parties, right? Like, what I didn't do is reach out and say, hey, would you like to just buy some books for your students? Period, right? Like, no, I'm not going to come down. I'm not going to do, right? Because that's just asking somebody to spend money on me. And people don't want that. You can't ask for an opportunity. You have to be the opportunity. And so I understand that when I go somewhere and somebody says yes to me, it's probably because my presence somewhere serves some kind of value to them, whatever it is, right? Sometimes it's just value to the students, sometimes it's value to the students plus value to the school's supporters plus value to something else. Like this, somebody made a calculation that ultimately led to, yes, come on down and we'll spend some money on your books. Yes. And I want to make sure that I am, when I'm presenting myself, no matter who it is that I'm talking to, I'm always making sure I understand that you need value, I'm here to provide that value, and in turn, we'll both get value. That's how I think about it.
All right, this has been so valuable, playing off of that word. I mean, just golden nuggets of information and great stuff. Jason, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah. Appreciate it.
That does it for this episode of the Class E podcast. Remember, I'm your host, Mary Sturgill. This podcast is put on in partnership with the Hill Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship and the Communication Studies Department here at Furman University. It is produced by student producers, Eliza Polich, Kayla Patterson, and we have a special cameraman today, Andre DeCastro. Give those guys a round of applause. You can find us wherever you listen to your podcast and on YouTube, so hit that subscribe button so you do not miss an episode of great conversations like we just had with Jason. Until next time, everybody, dream big.